The sun bled out across the New Mexico desert, staining the horizon in hues of bruised purple and fiery orange. It was a beautiful, merciless sky, the kind that offered no comfort, only a vast and lonely canvas for a girl's desperate flight. Dust, fine as powdered bone, kicked up around Ellie's worn-out boots, coating her torn calico dress in a film of gritty red. Every breath was a shard of glass in her lungs, a ragged, panicked sob she couldn't afford to release. Behind her, somewhere in the shimmering heat haze, were the sounds that had haunted her for 3 days, the jingle of a spur, the coarse laugh of a man who believed he owned her, the thunder of hooves on packed earth. Her gaze was fixed on the iron snake slithering across the plains, its black smoke a defiant smudge against the dying light. A freight train, slow and lumbering as it climbed a gentle grade. It was her last chance, her only chance. The whistle blew, a long, mournful cry that echoed in the empty expanse. And it sounded to Ellie like a call to salvation or damnation, she wasn't sure which. And at this point, she didn't care. Her legs screamed, muscles knotted and burning. Her bare arms were a roadmap of scratches from mesquite and cactus spines she'd blundered through in the dark. But the fear was a whip, lashing her forward, driving her past the point of exhaustion. The rhythmic clack-clack, clack-clack of the train's wheels grew louder, a mechanical heartbeat she strained to match. She could smell the coal smoke and hot metal now, a scent of industry and escape that was more potent than any perfume. The last car, an open-topped cattle car, was tantalizingly close. Its wooden slats were weathered and splintered, and the floor was dark with stains she didn't want to think about. It was ugly, filthy, and the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. With a final, guttural cry that was more animal than human, she pushed off the balls of her feet, her fingers clawing for a handhold. They scraped against rough wood, found purchase on a cold iron rung, and for a terrifying second, her body swung out over the blur of the tracks below. Grime and splinters dug into her palms. With a surge of adrenaline, she hauled herself up, tumbling over the side and landing in a heap on the grimy floorboards. She lay there, gasping, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The world was a dizzying swirl of motion and noise. The train rocked beneath her, a rough cradle carrying her away. For a full minute, she just breathed, sucking in the dusty air, tears of relief and pain streaking through the dirt on her face. She had made it. She was away. Slowly, shakily, she pushed herself into a sitting position, pulling her knees to her chest and trying to make herself as small as possible. The sun had dipped below the horizon now, and the desert was falling into a deep, velvety twilight. The air grew cooler, raising goosebumps on her exposed skin. She shivered, though not entirely from the cold. The immediate danger was past, but the terror lingered, a cold knot in her stomach. They would not give up so easily. She knew the man her father had sold her to. She knew his pride, his cruelty. He would see her flight as a personal insult, a theft of his property. He would hunt her to the ends of the earth. It was then, as her eyes adjusted to the deepening gloom, that she realized she was not alone. He was in the far corner of the car, a silhouette against the fading sky. He had been there the whole time, as still and silent as a statue carved from the desert rock itself. Her heart leaped into her throat, a fresh wave of panic washing over her. She scrambled backward, pressing herself against the rough wooden slats, her mind racing. Was he one of them? Had they been waiting for her? But he didn't move. He just stood there, a tall, broad-shouldered shape wrapped in a long, canvas duster that fell to his ankles. A wide-brimmed hat was pulled low, shadowing his face completely. He seemed less like a man and more like a feature of the landscape, something that had grown out of the shadows and dust. There was no menace in his stillness, none of the leering aggression she was used to. There was just presence, an immovable, quiet weight in the corner of the car. The train rumbled on. carrying them deeper into the night. The stars began to appear, cold and distant diamonds scattered on black velvet. Ellie watched him, her breath held tight in her chest. She couldn't see his face, couldn't read his intentions. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy, broken only by the clatter of the wheels on the track. He hadn't acknowledged her arrival in any way. He hadn't moved a muscle. It was as if she were a tumbleweed that had blown into the car, of no more consequence than a gust of wind. For a long while, she remained frozen, a coiled spring of fear. But as the miles rolled by, a different kind of desperation began to set in. The train would have to stop eventually, at a water tower, a station, a siding, and when it did, they would be searching for her. They would check every car. A lone girl, ragged and filthy, she would be impossible to miss. She had to take a chance. She had to trust someone, or she was lost. This silent, still man was an unknown quantity, a risk, but the men behind her were a certainty of brutality and despair. She chose the risk. Uncoiling from her tight ball, she crept forward on her hands and knees. The floorboards were rough under her palms, digging into the scrapes and cuts. She moved slowly, deliberately, like a supplicant approaching a grim-faced idol. She stopped a few feet from him, not daring to get closer. He still hadn't moved, but she could feel his awareness of her, a palpable sense of attention in the darkness. She imagined she could feel his eyes on her from beneath the brim of his hat. She had to force the words out. Her throat was raw, her voice a dry, cracked whisper that was almost lost in the noise of the train. "Please," she breathed, the single word, a prayer. "Please, sir." There was no response, not a twitch, not a shift in his weight. He just stood there, a pillar of silence. Doubt flooded her. Had he even heard her? Was he even real? She swallowed, the sound loud in her own ears, and tried again, the words tumbling out in a rushed, desperate plea. "They're hunting me. Men, they'll be looking for me when the train stops. Please, don't let them take me." The final words were a sob she couldn't hold back. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the rejection, for the rough command to get away from him, for the cold indifference that was all she had ever known from men. She waited for him to push her away, or worse, to grab her and hold her for the reward he could surely claim. Instead, something else happened. Slowly, with no sound but the soft rustle of heavy fabric, the edge of his duster lifted. An arm she hadn't seen move raised the canvas coat, creating a dark, narrow space between his body and the heavy material. It was a simple gesture, offered without a word, without a glance. There was no question in it, no judgment, no demand for payment or explanation. It was just an offer, a silent, immediate sanctuary. For a heartbeat, Ellie was too stunned to move. She stared at the dark opening, at the promise of concealment it held. It was more kindness than she had been shown in years, and it came from a man whose face she couldn't even see. Tears welled in her eyes again, but these were different. They weren't born of terror, but of a strange, aching gratitude that was so intense it hurt. She didn't hesitate. Scrambling the last few feet, she slipped into the space he had made. The duster fell, cloaking her in absolute darkness. She was pressed against him, her cheek against the rough canvas of his coat, her side against the solid warmth of his leg. He smelled of trail dust, leather, and something else, something clean and faintly metallic, like rain on rock. He was a wall at her back, steady and unyielding. The constant, jarring motion of the train seemed to fade, muted by his sheer stillness. From outside her small, dark world, she could hear the rumble of the wheels and the lonely cry of the wind. But in here, there was only the sound of her own shaky breathing and the slow, steady rhythm of his. He didn't speak. He didn't shift or move to make her more comfortable or to push her away. He simply stood, a silent guardian, a human shield, huddled in the darkness, hidden from the vast, predatory world. Ellie felt a single, fragile seed of hope begin to take root in the barren wasteland of her heart. She didn't know his name. She didn't know his face. All she knew was the feel of his coat around her and the silent promise he had made. For now, it was enough. For now, she was safe. Time became a thick, syrupy thing in the darkness beneath the duster. For Ellie, each clack of the wheels on the track was a tick of a clock counting down to her recapture. She stayed perfectly still, pressed against the stranger's leg, trying to shrink into herself, to become nothing more than a shadow within a shadow. The man, Silas Boone, though she didn't yet know his name, was as motionless as the granite formations they passed in the gloom. He was a mountain of stillness, and she was a trembling mouse hiding in its crevices. She felt the slight change in the train's rhythm before she heard it, a subtle shift in vibration that traveled up from the floorboards, through his boots, and into her body. The rhythmic clatter began to slow, each beat elongating, punctuated by a long, metallic groan that shuddered through the entire car. A hiss of steam followed, loud and startlingly close. Her breath hitched. This was it, a stop. Her sanctuary was about to be breached. She could hear the faint, distant sounds of a settlement, a dog barking, the tinny notes of a poorly played piano, a station. Her stomach twisted into a cold, hard knot. Hidden in the dark, she heard the heavy thud of boots landing on the wooden floor of their car. Not one set, but several. They landed with an arrogant weight, the sound of men who believed the ground they walked on belonged to them. "Check this one, too," a voice growled. It was a gravelly, unpleasant sound, thick with impatience and whiskey. It was a voice she knew. Harker, the man who wore her father's debt like a badge of ownership. A wave of nausea rolled through her. "It's just a cattle car." "Harker," another, stupider voice complained. "Nothing in here but stinking splinters." "You get paid to look, not to think, you half-wit," Harker snarled back. "The station master said he saw something scramble into the last car back at the grade. Now spread out. I want to see every damn corner." Ellie's world shrank to the space of a single, terrified breath. She could feel her own heart trying to beat its way out of her chest, a frantic drumming against her ribs. She was certain they could hear it. She pressed herself harder against the stranger's leg, her fingers digging into the rough fabric of his trousers. Through it all, he did not move. There was no tensing of muscle, no quick intake of breath. If he felt any fear, he gave no sign. He was a bulwark, a silent denial of the danger that was now only feet away. The heavy footsteps crunched across the grimy floorboards, coming closer. A lantern beam cut through the darkness, its yellow light playing across the wooden slats above her head. She squeezed her eyes shut, as if not seeing them would make her invisible. "Just a pile of rags over there," the second voice said. "Then kick it," Harker commanded. The footsteps stopped directly in front of them. Ellie could smell stale sweat and cheap cigars, a scent that brought back a flood of terrifying memories. She braced for the kick, for the duster to be ripped away, for Harker's triumphant, cruel face to be staring down at her. "What about you?" Friend Harker's voice was dangerously soft now. A predator's croon, enjoying the night air. The question hung in the air, directed at the silent man who shielded her. Ellie held her breath, waiting for him to speak, to betray her, to save his own skin. It's what anyone would do. It's what her own father had done. The stranger said nothing. "Cat got your tongue," Harker chuckled. "A humorless sound. Or are you just rude? We're looking for a girl, little thing, pretty, in a scrawny sort of way. Name's Ellie. She belongs to me. You seen her?" The silence stretched on, thick and defiant. Ellie could feel a new quality in it now. It wasn't just quiet. It was a refusal, a challenge. "Fine," Harker spat, his patience gone. "Be that way. Zeb, check under his coat. Make sure he ain't hiding a bottle from us." A shadow fell over them as one of the men stepped forward. A hand reached out, thick, dirty fingers aiming for the collar of the duster. And then, everything happened at once. The stranger moved with a speed that was shocking in its suddenness. It wasn't a panicked motion, but one of pure, explosive efficiency. One moment he was a statue, the next, he was a blur of controlled violence. A hand shot out from the duster not to strike, but to seize the wrist of the reaching man. Zeb! There was a sickening crack of bone and a high-pitched scream. Simultaneously, the stranger pivoted, using his shoulder to slam into the third man, sending him staggering back into Harker. It was all the time he needed, before Ellie could even process what had happened. A hand clamped around her upper arm. The grip was like iron, firm and inescapable. But it wasn't cruel. It was pulling her, lifting her. "Now," he said. It was the first word he had spoken. His voice was low and rough, like stones grinding together, a sound that seemed to come from the very earth. It was not a request. It was a command that expected absolute obedience. He didn't wait for her to respond. He was already moving, dragging her with him toward the side of the slowly moving train. Behind them! Harker was roaring with rage, untangling himself from his men. "Get him! Shoot the bastard!" The edge of the cattle car was a dizzying precipice. The ground was a dark, rushing blur below. For a second, Ellie's feet froze, her mind screaming in protest, "Jump into that!" He gave her no choice. His arm wrapped around her waist, pulling her tight against his side. He didn't leap so much as step off into the void, taking her with him. The fall was a heart-stopping moment of weightlessness. The wind ripped the air from her lungs, then they hit the ground. It was a brutal impact. They landed in a cascade of sand and gravel that tore at her skin. They rolled, a tangle of limbs and flying canvas. Pain erupted in her shoulder and hip as they slammed against the unforgiving earth. Her head struck something hard, and for a disoriented second, the stars above seemed to spin and blur. A gunshot cracked through the night, the bullet whining past them and smacking into a rock somewhere in the darkness. The sound shocked her back to full awareness. The stranger was already untangling himself, his grip never leaving her arm. He hauled her to her feet. Her legs were shaky, threatening to buckle. "Run!" he ordered, his voice still the same low, urgent rumble. And they ran. He pulled her away from the tracks, away from the shouts and curses fading behind them, and into the vast, open desert. The land was not flat. It was a treacherous moonscape of rocks, thorny creosote bushes, and sudden dips in the terrain. Every step was a risk. Her thin boots slid on loose shale, and she would have fallen a dozen times if not for the unyielding grip that held her up, that pulled her relentlessly forward. Her lungs were on fire. A sharp, stitching pain flared in her side. Her earlier exhaustion was nothing compared to this. This was a desperate flight, fueled by pure terror. The sounds of pursuit were gone now, swallowed by the immense silence of the desert. But their presence was a ghost at her back, propelling her onward. The man beside her moved with a strange, loping grace, seeming to glide over the terrain that threatened to trip her at every step. He was tireless, his breathing deep and even while she was gasping and sobbing for air. He never looked back. His focus was entirely on the path ahead, his head scanning the dark horizon. He seemed to know this land, to read its shadows and contours as if it were a map. They scrambled through a dry wash, the loose sand sucking at her feet, and up the other side, her hands scraping against sharp rock. Her dress was in tatters, her skin a tapestry of new cuts and bruises. She was running on instinct alone now, her mind a numb haze of pain and fear. The only thing that felt real was the man's hand on her arm, a solid anchor in the chaos. It was no longer just a grip, it was a lifeline. He wasn't just making her run, he was keeping her from collapsing, from giving up. After what felt like an eternity, he veered sharply to the right, toward a dark mass of rock that rose from the desert floor like the spine of some great, sleeping beast. It was a small canyon, a jagged scar in the earth. He pulled her toward it, his pace not slackening. The final approach was a near vertical climb. He released her arm only to place a hand on her back, shoving her upward. "Go! Up!" Her fingers, raw and bleeding, clawed for purchase on the rock face. She found a ledge, hauled herself over, and then he was right behind her, pushing her again. They scrambled into a narrow fissure, a deep crack in the rock no wider than a doorway. It was a dark, tight space, smelling of dust and cold stone. He pulled her deeper into the crevice, until the faint starlight was completely obscured. Then he let go. The sudden absence of his touch was as jarring as the jump from the train. Ellie stumbled forward and collapsed against the rough rock wall, her legs finally giving out. She slid down to the ground, a trembling, gasping heap. The silence that descended was absolute, broken only by the ragged sound of her own breathing and the loud, frantic thumping of her own heart. For a long time, she just lay there, curled into a ball, trying to draw a full breath. Every part of her body ached. Her mind was a maelstrom of terror and disbelief. She had jumped from a moving train. She had been shot at. She had run for miles across a brutal wilderness. And she had done it all at the side of a man she didn't know. A man who had acted without hesitation or explanation. Slowly, the adrenaline began to recede, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. She became aware of him again, a dark shape moving with impossible quiet in the narrow space. He hadn't sat down. He was standing at the entrance to their hiding place, a silent watchman, peering out into the night. He had saved her, not just once on the train, but twice. He had fought for her. He had jumped with her. He had dragged her to safety. And he still had not asked a single question. There were no flirtatious remarks about her being in his debt, no probing inquiries into why she was being hunted. There was no conversation at all. His protection was a physical thing, a series of actions, not words. It was a promise made with cracked knuckles and a desperate run under the stars. Huddled in the cold, dark crevice, bleeding and bruised, Ellie looked at the silhouette of the man standing guard. He was a stranger, a mystery, but in the desolate landscape of her life, where promises were broken as easily as they were made, his silent, violent protection felt more real and more binding than any vow she had ever heard. The sheltering had begun. Dawn broke not with a gentle blush, but with a sharp, clinical line of light drawn across the eastern horizon. It illuminated a world of red rock and pale, sand-colored earth. In the narrow crevice, the cold had seeped deep into Ellie's bones, and she awoke from a fitful, shallow sleep with a shiver that racked her entire body. Her first conscious thought was of Harker, and she sat bolt upright, a gasp catching in her throat. The space was empty except for her. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her for a terrifying moment before she saw him. He was standing just outside the fissure, a tall silhouette against the growing light, his back to her as he surveyed the vast, empty landscape. He was still watching. He had been watching all night. He must have heard her stir, because he turned his head slightly. He didn't speak, but his posture shifted, a subtle signal that it was time to move. Ellie got to her feet, her muscles screaming in protest. Every part of her was a dull, throbbing ache. She looked down at herself. Her dress was shredded. Her arms and legs were a mess of scratches, and she was caked in a layer of grime and dried blood. She felt like a stray dog, wretched and unwanted. When she stumbled out of the crevice, he was waiting. He looked her over, his gaze lingering for a moment on her torn dress and bare, scraped arms. His face, visible now in the morning light, was as rugged and unyielding as the landscape around them. It was a map of hard living, with lines etched around his eyes and a strong, square jaw that looked like it had never known a smile. His eyes were a pale, washed-out blue, the color of the sky on a high, clear day, and they held no judgment, only a calm, assessing quality. Without a word, he unbuttoned his duster. He wasn't wearing much underneath, just a simple, collarless shirt and trousers held up by suspenders. He shrugged out of the heavy canvas coat and held it out to her. Ellie stared at it, then at him, confused. "Take it," he said, his voice the same low rumble she'd heard in the dark. "It's a long walk." She hesitated for only a second before taking the coat. It was surprisingly heavy, imbued with the faint scent of trail dust and the man himself. She slipped her arms into it, and the duster enveloped her, the sleeves dangling far past her hands, the hem brushing her ankles. It was a ridiculous fit, but it was warm, and it covered her ruined dress and the goosebumps on her skin. It felt like a shield. He turned and began to walk, a steady, ground-eating stride that she had to half-jog to keep up with. He led them not back toward the railroad tracks, but deeper into the wilderness, following the contours of the land, navigating through canyons and across dry, rocky mesas. The sun climbed higher, beating down with a relentless intensity. The heat was a physical weight. Soon, the warmth of the duster became a sweltering prison, but she didn't dare take it off. It was the only thing she had. They walked in silence. He never looked back to see if she was following, yet he seemed to pace himself to her own exhausted, stumbling gait. When she tripped on a loose rock, a hand would shoot back to steady her, his grip firm on her elbow, setting her right before releasing her and continuing on without a word. Once, when she felt she could not take another step, her vision starting to swim with black spots, he stopped. He unhooked a canteen from his belt and handed it to her. The water was warm and tasted of metal, but it was the most precious thing she had ever tasted. She drank greedily, then handed it back. He took a small sip himself before securing it and starting off again. The desert was a harsh and beautiful place. Towering buttes of red rock reached for the sky, their sides carved by millennia of wind and water. Saguaro cacti stood like silent, multi-armed sentinels. A hawk circled high overhead, riding the thermal currents. For the first time in days, Ellie was able to see beyond the narrow scope of her own terror. She saw the subtle colors of the rock, the delicate resilience of a pale desert flower growing in the shadow of a boulder. Her fear was still there, a cold stone in her gut, but the world was starting to seep back in around its edges. Late in the afternoon, when the sun was beginning its long descent and the shadows were stretching like long, dark fingers across the land, he stopped on a high ridge. He pointed. "There," he said. Ellie followed his gesture, squinting against the light. At first, she saw nothing but more red dust and rock. Then she spotted it. It was a small, solitary speck of human endeavor in the vast emptiness. Nestled at the base of a towering mesa, a small cabin, a barn that leaned as if tired, a single windmill turning with a slow, rhythmic creak in the breeze, and a spider web of wooden fences. It looked fragile, temporary, as if the desert could swallow it whole in a single gust of wind. It took them another hour to reach it. As they drew closer, the details emerged. The cabin was built of weathered, sun-bleached wood, the color of old bones. A thin curl of smoke rose from a stone chimney. A few chickens scratched in the dust near a small, fenced-in garden where some determined-looking plants wilted in the heat. It was a poor, hard-scrabble place, clinging to life with a quiet desperation that Ellie understood completely. As they entered the yard, the front door of the cabin opened. A small boy stood framed in the doorway. He couldn't have been more than 6 years old, with a shock of unruly blonde hair and a face smudged with dirt. He was wearing a patched-up shirt that was too big for him and no shoes. He didn't run to them or call out. He just stood there, his expression solemn, his eyes a startlingly dark blue, fixed on Silas. Silas walked up onto the porch and crouched down, bringing himself to the boy's level. He didn't smile, but the hard lines of his face seemed to soften. He placed a large, calloused hand on the boy's shoulder. "Tom," he said, his voice softer than Ellie had yet heard it. "This is Ellie. She'll be staying for a bit." The boy, Tom, shifted his gaze from Silas to her. He looked her up and down, taking in the huge, trailing duster and the dirt on her face. His eyes were not a child's eyes. They were old and watchful, full of a caution that went far beyond his years. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, then turned and disappeared back into the dark interior of the cabin. Silas stood up and looked at Ellie. "Come on," he said, and led her inside. The inside of the cabin was one small, tidy room. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. There was a rough-hewn wooden table with 2 chairs, a small iron stove, and 2 cots against the far wall. A few shelves held tin plates and some books. Everything was worn, but it was clean. It was a space stripped down to the bare essentials of survival. Tom was standing by the stove, watching a pot of something bubble. "He was in town," Silas said, answering the question Ellie hadn't dared to ask. His voice was low, and he didn't look at her, instead busying himself with checking the water bucket by the door. "Had no one, so I brought him back." "Picked up from town." The words echoed in Ellie's mind. Silas hadn't rescued Tom. He had simply picked him up, like a stray kitten or a fallen fledgling, just like he had picked her up. She looked from the solemn little boy to the quiet, imposing man, and a strange sense of kinship settled over her. They were a collection of strays, washed up at the edge of the world. That first evening was a study in silence. Silas gestured for her to sit at the table. He ladled a thick, plain stew into 3 bowls. They ate without speaking. The only sounds, the scrape of spoons against tin and the crackle of the fire. The stew was bland, but it was hot, and it filled the aching emptiness in her stomach. After they ate, Silas pointed to a basin of water and a bar of lye soap. Ellie understood. She washed her face and hands, the soap stinging her cuts, but the clean water felt like a blessing. When it was time to sleep, Silas took a spare blanket from a chest and laid it on the floor near the hearth. He didn't offer her a cot. He didn't say a word. He just created a space for her. He and Tom took the 2 cots, and Silas was asleep almost instantly, his breathing deep and even. Ellie lay down on the blanket, pulling the rough wool up to her chin. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting a soft, warm light on the room. Outside, the wind whispered around the corners of the cabin, a lonely, mournful sound. But inside, it was warm and still. She could hear the quiet breathing of the man and the boy. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she was behind a closed, bolted door. There were no leering eyes, no threatening voices, no fear of a hand grabbing her in the dark. The days that followed fell into a simple, quiet rhythm. No one told her what to do, but she found work for herself. She took the needle and thread she found in a small sewing box and began mending Tom's shirts and Silas's spare pair of trousers. The work was small, but it felt good to make something whole again. She swept the dust that perpetually tried to invade the cabin from the porch. She helped Tom feed the chickens, their quiet clucking a peaceful, domestic sound. She learned to read the men in her life. Tom communicated with his eyes, a quick glance to show her where the bucket was, a slight widening of his eyes when she found a rare, unbroken egg in the coop. Silas communicated with gestures. A nod toward the wood pile meant he needed more for the fire. A hand held out meant he needed her to pass him a tool while he was fixing a broken hinge on the barn door. Words were a rare currency, spent only when absolutely necessary. One afternoon, while Silas was out checking fences, she found a small, withered patch of ground behind the cabin that must have once been a garden. Weeds had all but choked it out, but she saw the stubborn leaves of a few mint plants. She spent hours in the hot sun, pulling weeds, her hands growing raw, turning over the dry, compacted earth with a rusty trowel she found in the barn. She carried bucket after bucket of water from the windmill, her arms aching, and soaked the parched soil. It was back-breaking work, but it was hers. She was not running from something. She was building something, however small. In the evenings, she would watch Silas teach Tom to read. He would sit at the table with one of the worn books, his large, rough finger tracing the words as he pronounced them slowly and clearly. Tom would sit beside him, his small face scrunched in concentration, his voice a soft murmur as he repeated the sounds. It was a scene of such quiet, gentle domesticity that it made Ellie's heart ache. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the knot of fear that had been lodged in her chest for so long began to loosen its grip. She found herself breathing more deeply. She stopped jumping at every unexpected sound. One evening, as she sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant strokes of orange and pink, she realized that she had not once looked over her shoulder all day. She had not scanned the horizon for the dust cloud of approaching riders. The thought was so startling that she froze. She was not safe. Not really. The world was still a dangerous place, and Harker was still out there somewhere. But here, in this small, silent cabin, surrounded by a vast and empty desert, with a quiet man and a watchful boy, she felt something she had not felt since she was a very small child. She felt sheltered. The constant, thrumming hum of anxiety that had been the soundtrack to her life was fading, replaced by the creak of the windmill, the clucking of chickens, and the profound, healing power of silence. She was no longer being hunted. She was simply living. The fierce New Mexico sun was a constant, powerful presence, bleaching the landscape to pale shades of ochre and rust. The heat of the day was a physical thing, a heavy blanket that settled over the small ranch and demanded a slow, deliberate pace of life. Weeks bled into one another, marked not by a calendar but by the rising and setting of that sun, the phases of the moon, and the small, steady progress of Ellie's reclaimed garden patch. The world beyond their rocky sanctuary began to feel like a distant, half-forgotten dream. The frantic chase, the terror in the dark. Harker's snarling face, it was all still there, locked away in a dark corner of her mind. But it was no longer the first thing she thought of when she woke. The first thing she thought of now was the water, the urgent need to tend to her thirsty plants before the sun grew too strong. Her life had shrunk to the size of this small homestead, and within its quiet borders, she was finding a strange and unexpected peace. The silence that had initially felt so vast and intimidating had become a language all its own, a comfortable space where words were unnecessary. She, Silas, and Tom moved around one another in a quiet, practiced choreography, their lives interwoven through shared tasks and unspoken understanding. The first gesture was so small she almost missed it. One morning, she came out onto the porch, blinking in the early light, and saw it sitting on the rough-hewn railing, a single desert marigold, a burst of defiant yellow against the weathered gray wood. It wasn't from her garden. Her own plants were still just tender green shoots. This flower was wild, its stem sturdy and its petals vibrant. It must have been picked from the base of the mesa, a long walk from the cabin. She looked around. The yard was empty. Silas was already out, likely checking the perimeter fences as he did every dawn. Tom was still asleep inside. The flower was simply there, left by an unseen hand. She picked it up, its velvety petals soft against her calloused fingertips. It was a simple thing, a weed to most, but it was beautiful. It felt like a message, though she couldn't decipher its meaning. It wasn't a gift of courtship. The idea was so foreign, so absurd, that it didn't even enter her mind. It felt more like an acknowledgement, a quiet statement that said, "I saw this, and I thought of you." She took the flower inside and put it in a tin cup of water, placing it on the windowsill where it caught the morning sun. For the rest of the day, her eyes kept drifting to that small splash of color, a silent testament to a moment of unexpected grace. The gestures continued, always practical, always silent. Her work in the garden was a battle against the sun. She would spend the late morning hours on her knees, pulling weeds and loosening the soil, the heat pressing down on her back. She often grew so absorbed in the work that she would forget to drink, her head starting to feel light and fuzzy before she remembered. One afternoon, as she sat back on her heels to wipe the sweat from her brow, she saw it. A tin cup, identical to the one that now held her flour, was sitting on a nearby fence post. It hadn't been there moments before. She looked toward the barn, where Silas had been mending a harness. He was still there, his back to her, his movements focused and deliberate. He hadn't said a word. He had simply seen her need and met it. She walked over and picked up the cup. The metal was cool against her hot skin, and the water inside, freshly drawn from the deep well, was shockingly cold and clean. She drank it all, the relief immediate and profound. It was more than just water. It was an act of quiet observation, of care. He had noticed her, not as a burden or a stray, but as a person with needs. She put the empty cup back on the post and returned to her work, her movements a little lighter, the sun feeling a little less oppressive. Their lives were a tapestry woven from these silent threads. He would leave a pile of smaller, more manageable logs by the cabin door, saving her the effort of splitting the larger ones for the stove. She, in turn, noticed the way he winced when he put weight on his left knee, an old injury that ached in the cold desert nights. She began boiling willow bark, a remedy she'd seen her grandmother use, and would leave a steaming mug of the bitter tea on the table for him after supper. He would drink it without comment, and the next morning, his limp would be a little less pronounced. She noticed a tear in the seam of his only good shirt and took it while he slept, mending it with small, neat stitches that were nearly invisible. He never mentioned the repair, but she saw him run his thumb over the seam the next morning, a flicker of something unreadable in his pale eyes. The porch steps where she liked to sit in the evenings to do her mending were old and splintered. She was used to it, shifting her weight to avoid the worst of the rough spots. One evening she came outside, her sewing basket in hand, to find a square of folded burlap, thick and clean, placed exactly where she always sat. It was a simple cushion, a barrier against the splinters. She stopped, her hand hovering over the rough fabric. It was such a small thing, a piece of a discarded grain sack, but it was an act of profound tenderness. She sat down, the burlap coarse but comfortable beneath her. She looked out at the vast, silent landscape, the rocks glowing red in the setting sun, and felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the temperature. She was being cared for, in small, practical ways that mattered more than any pretty words or grand pronouncements. Tom, in his own quiet way, became part of this silent conversation. He would follow her around the yard, a small, solemn shadow. He began to bring her things, treasures found on his wanderings, a perfectly smooth, white stone, a hawk's feather, its edges sharp and precise, a strangely shaped piece of driftwood that looked like a coiled snake. He would simply hold them out to her in his small, grubby hand. She would take them with equal solemnity, thanking him with a small smile. She lined his treasures up on the windowsill next to her marigold. They were forming their own language, a family of three, bound not by blood, but by a shared understanding of solitude and the power of small kindnesses. One day, Silas began a larger project replacing a long section of the corral fence that had been weakened by rot and termites. It was a two-person job. He didn't ask for her help, but she came out after her morning chores were done and stood watching. He was trying to hold a heavy post steady with one hand while using a mallet to pack the earth around its base with the other. It was an awkward, inefficient process. Without a word, she walked over, took the post from him, and braced it with her body. Holding it perfectly straight, he stopped, looking at her for a long moment. She met his gaze, her own expression steady. A silent agreement passed between them. He nodded once, a short, sharp dip of his chin, and went back to work. They worked together all day under the hot sun. She would hold the posts while he set them, her arms aching from the strain. She would fetch new rails, dragging the heavy wood across the dusty yard. She would hand him the hammer, the nails, the saw, anticipating what he needed before he had to gesture for it. Their hands brushed against each other countless times, brief, accidental touches that sent a strange, unfamiliar jolt through her. They didn't speak a single word, but their movements became a fluid, synchronized dance. They were a team, working as one to build something strong and lasting. By the time the sun began to set, the new section of fence was complete, a straight, sturdy line against the horizon. They stood side by side, covered in dust and sweat, looking at their shared work. A sense of pride, deep and satisfying, swelled in Ellie's chest. She had helped. She had contributed. She was not just being sheltered. She was a part of this place. Silas turned to her, his face streaked with dirt, his pale eyes seeming to shine in the fading light. "Good work," he said. The two words were startling in the quiet of the evening. They were words of praise, of acknowledgement. They made her feel as if she'd just been handed a precious gift. She could only nod, her throat suddenly tight. That night, a cold wind swept down from the mountains, rattling the cabin's single window and finding its way through the cracks in the walls. After their silent supper, Ellie took her usual seat on the porch steps, pulling Silas's old duster tighter around her shoulders. The stars were brilliant in the clear, cold air, a spill of diamonds across black velvet. But the wind was sharp, and she shivered, her teeth chattering slightly. The cabin door opened, and Silas stepped out. He was holding a thick woolen blanket, the one from his own cot. He walked over to her and, without a word, he unfolded it and draped it over her shoulders, tucking it carefully around her. His large hands brushed her neck, his touch surprisingly gentle. The blanket was heavy and warm, smelling faintly of him, of wood smoke and clean earth. She looked up at him, her breath catching. He was standing over her, looking down, his expression unreadable in the shadows. For a long moment, their eyes met and held. It was more than a glance. It was a conversation. In his gaze, she saw not pity, but a deep, quiet concern. She saw respect. She saw the unspoken acknowledgement of everything that had passed between them, the flower, the water, the fence, the silent acts of care that had built a fragile bridge across the chasm of their loneliness. He gave a small nod, as if confirming what they both now knew: something had irrevocably changed. She was no longer just a fugitive he had rescued, and he was no longer just her savior. They were two solitary people who had found in each other a quiet harbor. He turned and went back inside, leaving her alone on the porch, wrapped in his warmth, under the vast, watchful canopy of the desert sky. And for the first time, Ellie felt the stirrings of a feeling that was deeper and more terrifying than gratitude, a feeling that felt dangerously close to hope. The rhythm of life on the ranch was dictated by necessity, a steady, predictable beat of chores and survival. Supper was over. The last of the salted bacon and beans had been eaten, the tin plates scraped clean. Tom, his small body heavy with sleep, had been tucked into his cot by Silas, a rare, gentle hand briefly brushing the hair from the boy's forehead. Outside, a profound silence had fallen over the desert, a quiet so deep it seemed to have a physical weight. The only sounds in the small cabin were the soft crackle and hiss of the fire in the hearth, and the gentle clink of plates as Ellie began the nightly ritual of washing up. She stood before a large basin of hot water set on a dry sink, her hands moving with an automatic, practiced grace. The lye soap was harsh, but the heat of the water was a comfort, seeping into her tired muscles. This small, domestic act had become an anchor in her day, a moment of quiet order at the close of the chaos of survival. Silas sat at the table behind her, not speaking, cleaning a part of a rifle with an oiled rag. His presence was a familiar comfort now, a silent, steady backdrop to her life, like the mesa that loomed over the cabin. She had grown so accustomed to their shared silence that it no longer felt empty, but rather full of unspoken understanding. But tonight, the silence felt different. It was heavier, pressing in on her. As she scrubbed at a stubborn spot on a plate, her gaze fell upon her own reflection in the murky water. A distorted, wavering image of a stranger with haunted eyes. The safety of this place, the steady kindness of the man behind her, had done its work. It had built a wall strong enough to keep the dangers of the world out. But it had also created a space quiet enough for the ghosts of her past to begin to speak. Her hands slowed, then stopped. She stood staring down into the basin, the plate forgotten in her grip. A tremor started in her fingers, a slight, almost imperceptible shaking. "My father," she said, the words emerging into the quiet room without her conscious permission. Her voice was a low, rusty thing, as if it hadn't been used for this kind of speech in a very long time. At the table, the rhythmic scrape of metal on metal stopped. She didn't have to look to know that Silas had paused, his attention now entirely on her. She kept her back to him, her eyes fixed on her own wavering reflection. She couldn't have spoken these words looking at him, or at anyone. They could only be said to the broken girl in the water. He was a man who liked the taste of whiskey more than he liked the sight of his own daughter. She continued, the words coming slowly, each one a heavy stone she had to lift and place into the silence. He had a ledger full of debts. His life was a series of numbers that never added up right. I was just another number to him, a way to clear a line in his book. She took a shaky breath, the air burning in her lungs. She could feel Silas's stillness behind her, an intense, focused quiet that was more unnerving than any question would have been. He was listening, and his listening demanded the truth. "There was a man, Harker." She said the name, and a bitter, coppery taste filled her mouth, the taste of fear. "He was older than my father. He had money, land. He owned the saloon where my father drank away whatever he earned. One day, the debt got too big. Harker wanted payment." She closed her eyes, and the scene was there, as vivid as if it were happening right now. The dim, smoky light of their small, squalid house, the smell of stale liquor and despair. Her father, his face slack and his eyes evasive, unable to look at her, and Harker, sitting at their table as if he owned it, his thick fingers drumming a slow, patient rhythm on the wood, his eyes moving over her not with desire, but with the cold, appraising look of a man inspecting livestock. "He didn't want cattle or land," Ellie whispered, her voice cracking. "He told my father he would take me. He said he would wipe the slate clean in exchange for me." She finally let the plate slip from her fingers. It sank into the greasy water with a soft splash. She wrapped her arms around her stomach, a reflexive, protective gesture. My father didn't even argue. He just nodded. He sold me, like a sack of grain, like a horse he couldn't afford to feed anymore. I was to be Harker's wife, he said, but we all knew what it was. I was property, payment for a whiskey debt. The shame of it was a physical thing, a hot, suffocating wave that rose from her stomach to her face. It had been her constant companion for years, a layer of grime on her soul that no soap could ever wash away. She had been treated as less than human, an object to be bartered, and a part of her had believed it. She had believed she was worthless, dirtied by the transaction, by the simple fact of her existence being assigned a monetary value and found wanting. "He was supposed to come for me in 3 days," she said, her voice barely audible over the crackling fire. "The night before he was due to arrive, I ran. I just took what little I had, and I ran into the dark. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I couldn't be there when he came. I couldn't let him put his hands on me." She shuddered, a violent, uncontrollable tremor. "He's a proud man, Harker. He doesn't see it as a girl running away. He sees it as his property being stolen. That's why they were hunting me, to get his property back." The story was finished. It lay in the air between them, ugly and exposed. She had laid bare the most shameful part of herself, the story that had defined her, that had made her feel unclean down to her very bones. She stood there, trembling, her back still to Silas, bracing herself for his reaction. She expected disgust, or worse, pity, which felt like another form of contempt. He would see her now as she saw herself damaged goods, a girl whose own father had thrown her away. He would regret helping her. He would want her gone. She waited for him to speak, to move, to do anything. The silence stretched, each second a small eternity. Then she heard the sound of the chair scraping softly against the wooden floor. She flinched, her shoulders hunching, preparing for the verdict. She heard his soft, heavy footsteps approach. He stopped just behind her. She could feel his presence, his warmth at her back. She squeezed her eyes shut, her heart hammering against her ribs. But he didn't touch her. He didn't speak. Instead, a hand reached past her, a large, calloused hand, and picked up a clean, dry dishcloth from the sink's edge. Then, he reached over to the small rack where she had placed the dishes she had already washed. He picked up a wet plate. Ellie opened her eyes. She turned her head just enough to see him out of the corner of her eye. He was standing beside her now, his expression as impassive as ever. He held the plate in one hand and the cloth in the other, and with slow, deliberate motions, he began to dry it, his large hands surprisingly careful with the fragile tin. He didn't look at her. His gaze was fixed on his task. He dried the first plate, his movements methodical and calm, and placed it on the shelf. Then he reached for another, and another. Ellie stood frozen, watching him. Her tears had stopped. The violent trembling in her body had subsided. She watched his hands, strong and steady, perform this simple, mundane chore. He hadn't recoiled in horror. He hadn't offered empty words of comfort. He hadn't treated her like a fragile, broken thing to be pitied. He had simply stepped into her work, into her space, and stood beside her. He had taken up a part of her burden, in the only way he knew how. In his silence, there was a profound and powerful message. There was no judgment. There was no disgust. There was only acceptance. He had heard the ugliest truth about her, and he had not turned away. He had, instead, picked up a towel. A slow, deep breath filled Ellie's lungs, the first full breath she felt she had taken all night. She turned back to the basin, to the dirty water and the remaining plates. She picked up a dish and began to wash. He stood beside her, taking each one as she finished, drying it and putting it away. They worked together in a comfortable, synchronized rhythm. The only sounds, the soft splash of water and the gentle scrape of cloth against tin. The shame that had been her second skin for so long began to feel distant. It hadn't vanished, but its power was diminished in the quiet, unassuming presence of this man. Her past was not a brand of disgrace. It was just a story. It was something that had happened to her. It was not the sum of who she was. He didn't see her as Harker's property or her father's debt. He saw her as Ellie, the woman who tended the garden, who mended his son's clothes, who stood beside him now, washing dishes. For the first time since her father had slammed that bottle on the table and sealed her fate, Ellie did not feel dirty. She felt the warm water on her hands. She felt the solid presence of the man beside her. And in the simple, shared act of cleaning up after a meal, she felt, deep in her soul, a profound and cleansing sense of peace. She felt clean. The peace of the high desert was a fragile thing, a glass-like silence that could be shattered by the slightest intrusion. For months, that peace had held. The days at Silas's ranch had settled into a comfortable, sun-drenched rhythm that felt as ancient and steady as the towering red mesa that watched over them. Ellie had come to love the stark beauty of the place, the way the light changed on the rocks throughout the day, the smell of dust and creosote after a rare, brief shower, the constant, low-level fear that had been her companion for so long had receded, becoming a faint, background hum, like the buzz of a distant cicada This day was like any other. The sun was a hot white coin in a vast blue sky. Ellie was on her knees in her small garden, her hands covered in the rich, dark earth she had so painstakingly cultivated. A few stubborn tomato plants were showing signs of fruit, and the mint she had rescued was thriving, its sharp, clean scent a welcome relief in the dry air. Tom was a few yards away, engrossed in a silent, serious game with a line of pebbles, arranging them into the shape of a snake. From the shade of the barn, she could hear the rhythmic rasp of a file on metal. Raoul, the old ranch hand who seemed to be a permanent fixture of the place, was mending a buckle. He was a man of even fewer words than Silas, with skin like cracked leather and eyes that had seen 80 years of this harsh, unforgiving sun. He had accepted her presence with a single, slow nod on her first day, and had not felt the need to elaborate since. It was the sound that came first, a disturbance in the fabric of the silence, a low, rhythmic drumming that was not the wind or the creak of the windmill. It was the sound of approaching horses, more than one, and they were moving fast. Ellie's head snapped up, her heart giving a painful, familiar lurch. Her eyes flew to the horizon, scanning the shimmering heat haze. For a moment, she saw nothing. Then, they appeared. 3 dark figures cresting a low rise, their forms wavering in the heat. They were not neighbors. They were not drifters. They rode with a grim, predatory purpose that she recognized in her very bones. Everything seemed to slow down. The rasping of Raoul's file stopped. Tom looked up from his pebbles, his small face suddenly tense. Ellie scrambled to her feet, her hands still caked with dirt. A cold dread, sharp and sickening, washed over her, undoing months of hard-won peace in a single, terrifying instant. Before she could even scream, Silas was there. He seemed to materialize from the barn, his face a hard, emotionless mask, but his pale eyes were chips of ice. He didn't look at her, but his first move was to step between her and the approaching riders. "Ellie, get the boy. Go inside. Bolt the door," he said, his voice a low, flat command that cut through her rising panic. She didn't hesitate. She scooped Tom into her arms, the boy's small body rigid with a fear he was too young to understand. "Inside. Tom," she whispered, her voice trembling as she hurried toward the cabin. She could feel his small arms wrapped tightly around her neck. She fumbled with the door, her hands shaking, and slammed it shut, dropping the heavy wooden bar into its iron brackets. It felt like a pathetically flimsy defense. She peered through a small, grimy window pane, her heart hammering against her ribs. The 3 riders had reached the yard. They reined in their horses, the animals snorting and stamping in the dust. And in the lead, a cruel, satisfied smile spreading across his face, was Harker. "Well, well," Harker called out, his voice a greasy, triumphant drawl that carried easily in the still air. "Look what we have here, a cozy little homestead. I have to say, girl, you led us on quite a chase." He ignored Silas completely, his eyes fixed on the cabin, on the window where he knew she was hiding. But the thing about property, my dear, is that it always finds its way back to its rightful owner. Silas stood his ground in the center of the yard, his feet planted, his body perfectly still. He was a lone, defiant figure against the 3 mounted men. "This is my land," Silas said, his voice dangerously quiet. "You're not welcome here. Ride on." Harker laughed, a short, ugly bark. "I'm not here for your land, friend. I'm here for what you stole from me." He swung down from his horse, his spurs jingling with a sound that made Ellie's blood run cold. His 2 men, Zeb and the other brute from the train, dismounted as well, fanning out, their hands hovering near the pistols on their hips. "I'm here for my wife." "She's not your wife," Silas said, his voice flat and final. "A piece of paper says otherwise. A debt paid in full." Harker sneered. "Now, are you going to step aside? Or do we have to get unpleasant?" Silas didn't answer with words. He simply shifted his weight slightly, A subtle, almost imperceptible movement that radiated menace. It was a clear and final refusal. Harker's smile vanished. "Unpleasant it is," he snarled. "Zeb, get the girl." Zeb started toward the cabin, a stupid, confident grin on his face. He never made it. Silas moved with the same shocking speed Ellie had seen on the train, closing the distance in 2 long strides. His fist shot out, a hard, compact blur of motion that connected with Zeb's jaw with a sickening crack. The man's head snapped back, and he crumpled to the dust like a sack of loose grain, unconscious before he hit the ground. For a moment, Harker and the third man were too stunned to react. Then, with a roar of rage, they both charged. What followed was a brutal, desperate ballet of violence. Silas was a force of nature, his movements economical and devastating. He ducked under a wild swing from Harker, driving his shoulder into the man's gut, sending him staggering back. He turned to face the third man, blocking a clumsy punch and returning with a series of short, hard blows to the man's ribs. Ellie watched, her hands pressed against the window, her breath held tight in her chest. A wild, terrified hope surged through her. He could do it. He could beat them. But there were 2 of them. While Silas was occupied with the third man, Harker, wheezing for breath, scrambled to his feet. His eyes darted around the yard, landing on a heavy iron branding iron lying near the fire pit. He snatched it up. "Silas, behind you!" Ellie screamed, her voice a useless, thin sound trapped behind the glass. Silas heard her. He shoved the man he was fighting away and started to turn. He was too late. Harker swung the heavy iron in a vicious arc. It caught Silas on the side of the head with a dull, sickening thud. Silas froze for a moment, his eyes wide with shock. A dark line of blood appeared at his temple. Then, like a great tree falling, his knees buckled, and he collapsed face first into the red dust. He didn't move. "No," Ellie whispered, the word a hollow, empty sound. The world seemed to tilt and spin. Her protector, her silent, unbreachable wall, was down. Harker stood over Silas's still form, breathing heavily, the branding iron dangling from his hand. "Stupid son of a bitch," he panted. He turned to his remaining man. "Get him out of the way, then get the door." The man, his face bruised and his lips split, looked from Silas's body to the cabin. The fight was gone from him, replaced by a sullen obedience. He started toward the cabin door. Panic, absolute and paralyzing, seized Ellie. She backed away from the window, pulling Tom with her. The boy was crying now, silent, terrified tears streaming down his face. Her mind was a white noise of terror. The old instincts screamed at her. Hide, run, disappear. There was nowhere to run. The heavy bar on the door would not hold for long. They were coming. The man reached the door and began to pound on it with his fist. "Open up, girl, it's over." The wood shuddered with each blow. Ellie stumbled backward, her eyes darting around the small, familiar room, searching for an escape that wasn't there. Her gaze fell upon the wall over the fireplace, and she saw it. Silas's rifle? It rested on 2 wooden pegs, a long, heavy piece of dark wood and blued steel. She had seen it every day. It was a part of the room, like the table or the chairs, an inanimate object. But now, it seemed to glow with a terrifying energy. She had never held a gun in her life. The very idea of it made her feel sick. Thump, thump, crack! A splinter of wood flew inward from the door. The sound broke through her paralysis. She looked at Tom, who was hiding his face in her skirt, his small body trembling. They were going to break the door down. They were going to take her. And what would they do to the boy? The thought was a shard of ice in her heart. Something inside her shifted. The terror was still there, a screaming, frantic thing. But something else rose to meet it, a fierce, protective rage she didn't know she possessed. They would not touch this child. Her legs moved, stiff and clumsy. She reached up and lifted the rifle from its pegs. The weapon was heavier than she could have imagined, cold and alien in her hands. It felt wrong. It felt evil. Her fingers fumbled on the stock, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold it steady. How did it work? She had watched Silas clean it. She had seen him load it, the hammer, the trigger. Crash! The door shuddered violently. A crack appeared down its center. She raised the rifle, the long barrel wavering wildly. It was too heavy. She propped it on the edge of the table, trying to aim it at the door. She fumbled for the hammer, her thumb slipping on the cold metal before she finally managed to pull it back. The sharp click was the loudest sound she had ever heard. She closed her eyes, her face pressed against the smooth, cool wood of the stock. She saw Silas lying in the dust. She saw Tom's terrified face. She saw Harker's leering smile. And she pulled the trigger. The explosion was a physical blow, a deafening roar that filled the small cabin. The rifle kicked back with brutal force, slamming into her shoulder and sending her stumbling backward. The room filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder. She opened her eyes. There was a large, splintered hole in the door. Outside, a man was screaming, not in pain, but in shock and rage. The pounding had stopped. Before she could even process what she had done, a second explosion rocked the yard. This one deeper, louder, a shotgun blast. She scrambled back to the window. The man who had been at the door was on his knees, clutching his leg, and Harker was staggering back, his shirt peppered with small, dark holes. Standing at the corner of the barn, a double-barreled shotgun still smoking in his gnarled hands, was Raoul. The old man's face was a grim mask, his ancient eyes blazing with a cold fire. "Get off this land!" Raoul's voice was a dry, reedy rasp, but it carried an authority of 80 hard years. "Or the next one's for your head." Harker stared at Raoul, then at the splintered cabin door, then at his two men, one unconscious, the other wounded. The fight was over. The easy victory he had imagined had turned into a bloody, humiliating rout. He had been beaten by an old man and a terrified girl. His face contorted with pure hatred. He looked at the cabin, his eyes finding Ellie in the window. "This isn't over!" he screamed, his voice raw with fury. "You hear me, you little witch? This is not over!" He grabbed the reins of his horse and hauled himself into the saddle. He helped his wounded man up onto Zeb's horse, and without a backward glance at the unconscious man in the dust, he spurred his mount and galloped out of the yard, a cloud of red dust rising in his wake. Silence descended again, thick and heavy with the aftershocks of violence. Ellie stared out the window, her body trembling from head to foot. The rifle slipped from her nerveless fingers and clattered to the floor. She ran to Tom and held him, burying her face in his hair, rocking him back and forth, murmuring incoherent words of comfort. After a moment, she gently pushed him toward his cot. "Stay here." Then she was at the door, fumbling with the broken bar, her hands clumsy and slick with sweat. She burst out into the yard. The air smelled of gunpowder and blood. Raoul was already kneeling beside Silas, his old, weathered face grim. Ellie fell to her knees on the other side. "Is he—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "He's breathing," Raoul grunted. "But he's hurt bad. That bastard near caved his head in." Ellie looked at Silas, her protector, lying broken and unconscious in the dust. His face was pale under its tan, and the blood from the gash on his temple was matting his dark hair. A wave of anguish, so powerful it almost stole her breath, washed over her. But there was no time for tears. There was work to be done. "Help me get him inside," she said, her voice shaking but clear. Together, she and the old man half-dragged, half-carried Silas into the cabin and laid him gently on his cot. Ellie stood up, her legs feeling like water. She looked down at her hands. They were still trembling, not just from fear anymore, but from the remembered kick of the rifle, from the sheer, terrible power of what she had done. She was still the same girl who had cowered under Silas's duster on the train. She was still terrified, but looking at the man she had to save, the boy she had to protect, and the home she had just defended with blood and steel. She knew one thing with absolute certainty. She was trembling. She was afraid. But she was no longer a victim. The world outside the cabin ceased to exist. For Ellie, reality shrank to the four walls of the small room, to the scent of blood and dust and lye soap, and to the still, silent form of the man on the cot. The violent, chaotic energy of the attack had dissipated, leaving behind a thick, heavy silence, a silence of waiting. It was a silence that was far more terrifying than the noise had been. Raoul, his face set in grim, ancient lines, helped her clean the wound. His gnarled hands, surprisingly steady, held the lamp while Ellie, her own hands trembling, carefully washed away the blood and dirt with a cloth dipped in warm water. The gash was ugly, a deep, jagged cut along his temple where the iron had struck. His skin was unnaturally pale beneath his tan, and his breathing was shallow, a faint, fragile whisper of life. "Head wounds are a bad business," Raoul said, his voice a dry rustle of leaves. "The fever will come. Just gotta keep him cool. Keep water in him if you can." He looked at her then, his faded eyes sharp and assessing. "You got the stomach for this, girl." Ellie looked from the old man's weathered face to Silas, lying broken and helpless because of her. The memory of the rifle's kick, of her own violent act, was a fresh, raw wound in her mind. But looking at Silas, another feeling rose, fierce and unyielding. It was her turn to be the wall. "I do," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Raoul nodded once, as if that was all the answer he needed. He went outside, and soon she heard the sound of a hammer on wood as he began to repair the splintered door. He was mending the physical defenses of the ranch. She had to mend the man who was its heart. The first day bled into the first night. Time became a meaningless river, flowing around the fixed point of her vigil. She sat in a wooden chair she'd pulled up beside his cot, a basin of cool water and a stack of clean rags at her feet. As Raoul had predicted, the fever came, a dry, malevolent heat that radiated from Silas's skin. He began to murmur, his head tossing back and forth on the pillow, his hands clenching and unclenching on the blanket. The words were a jumbled, broken stream of consciousness names she didn't know, places she'd never seen, fragments of a life lived long before she had tumbled into it. She bathed his forehead and his wrists with cool cloths, the water evaporating almost as soon as it touched his burning skin. She would dip, wring, and replace the cloths in a steady, endless rhythm. She watched the rise and fall of his chest, her own breath catching every time he seemed to pause too long between breaths. She forgot to eat. She forgot to sleep. Her entire being was focused on this one. Fragile life. Tom was a small, silent ghost in the corner of the cabin. He would watch her, his dark, serious eyes wide with a fear he couldn't articulate. He seemed to understand the gravity of the situation in a way that was far beyond his years. He didn't ask questions. He didn't cry. He just watched. On the second day, as she was wringing out a cloth, her own body weak with exhaustion, he came to her and tugged on her sleeve. He was holding out a tin cup of water from the bucket. It was his small offering, his attempt to help in the only way he knew how. Ellie's throat tightened. She took the cup, drank the water, and gave him a weak, grateful smile. He nodded solemnly and retreated back to his corner, his own vigil continuing. The days became a blur of quiet, desperate tasks. She made thin broth from the last of their salted meat, skimming the fat and straining it through a piece of cheesecloth until it was a clear, weak liquid. The hardest part was trying to get him to drink. She would lift his head with one arm, his dead weight a shocking burden, and try to spoon a few drops of the broth or some water between his cracked lips. Most of it would just dribble down his chin, but she was persistent, coaxing and whispering, celebrating the small victory of a single, reflexive swallow. She talked to him, her voice a low, constant murmur in the quiet room. She didn't know if he could hear her, but the silence felt too much like a tomb. She told him about her garden, about the tiny green tomatoes that were starting to form. She told him that Raoul had finished fixing the door, that it was stronger than before. She told him that Tom had found a lizard with a bright blue tail. She filled the space around him with the small details of the life he was fighting to return to, weaving a rope of simple, everyday words to try and pull him back from the dark, silent place he had gone. On the fourth day, she was changing the bandage on his head. She was exhausted, her body a single, dull ache, her eyes gritty from lack of sleep. As she worked, a small, worn, leather-bound book on the shelf beside his bed caught her eye. It wasn't one of the books he used to teach Tom. It was smaller, more personal, a ledger, perhaps, needing a moment's respite. She picked it up, her fingers tracing the worn cover. She opened it at random. The pages were filled with Silas's handwriting, a strong, spare script detailing crop yields from years past, prices of feed, notes on the weather. It was the simple, stark accounting of a solitary life. She turned a few more pages, a vague sense of guilt warring with her curiosity, and then she saw it. Pressed carefully between two pages, its color faded to a pale, ghostly yellow, was a desert marigold. She stopped breathing. She knew this flower. It was the one he had left for her on the porch railing all those weeks ago, her first morning at the ranch. She had kept it in a cup of water until it wilted, and then, with a small pang of regret, she had thrown it out, but he had kept one. He had picked it, left it for her, and saved another, pressing it within the pages of his life's ledger as if it were a thing of great value. She sank back into her chair, the open book resting in her lap. She stared at the small, fragile flower. It was a wordless message sent across time. It was his quiet acknowledgement of her arrival, a silent thank you for the life she had brought back to his sterile, orderly existence. All of his gestures, the cup of water, the cushioned seat, the warm blanket had been a conversation, and this was his clearest statement. He had seen her. He had valued her presence enough to preserve this small, simple token of it. Tears, hot and slow, welled in her eyes and traced paths through the grime on her cheeks. They weren't tears of fear or sadness. They were tears of a profound, aching tenderness. The wall she had so carefully constructed around her own heart, the wall that had been breached by his quiet kindness, now crumbled completely. This man who had saved her life, who had asked for nothing in return, had been speaking to her all along in a language she was only just beginning to understand. She gently closed the book and placed it back on the shelf, her movements full of a new reverence. She turned back to Silas. The fever seemed to have lessened slightly. His skin was cooler to the touch, and his breathing was a little deeper, a little more even. She picked up the damp cloth and gently wiped his brow, her touch no longer just that of a nurse, but of something more, something she didn't yet have a name for. 2 more days passed. The rhythm of her care continued, but now it was infused with a new sense of purpose, of fierce and tender hope. She was no longer just fighting for a stranger who had saved her. She was fighting for Silas. It was dawn on the 7th day. The first pale light of morning was filtering through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the still air. Ellie had fallen asleep in the chair, her head slumped against the hard wooden back, her sleep a shallow, exhausted state of near wakefulness. A sound, a small, dry whisper, cut through the quiet. Her eyes snapped open. She looked at the cot. Silas's eyes were open. They weren't wide, just barely slitted, and they were clouded with confusion and pain, but they were open, and they were looking at her. She froze, her heart seeming to stop in her chest. She was afraid to move, afraid to breathe, afraid this was just a dream born of her own exhaustion. For a long moment, they just looked at each other. His gaze was weak, but it was lucid. He was there, he was back. His lips moved, a dry, cracking motion. He tried to speak, but only a faint, rasping sound came out. She was at his side in an instant, a cup of water in her hand, her other hand gently lifting his head. She held the cup to his lips, and this time, he drank. It was a slow, difficult swallow, but he drank. She lowered his head back to the pillow. He closed his eyes for a moment, gathering what little strength he had. When he opened them again, they were clearer, more focused. They held a question. His voice, when it came, was a faint, hoarse whisper, a ghost of its usual rumble. Still here. The question was not about the room. It was about everything. About the fight, about the danger, about the cost of sheltering her. He was asking if, after all of it, after he had fallen, she had run. Ellie looked down at his pale, drawn face, at the vulnerability in his eyes, and the last of her fear dissolved, replaced by a deep, quiet certainty that settled in her soul like bedrock. She thought of her life before this place, a life of running, of hiding, of being less than nothing. And she thought of this life, of the garden, of the quiet boy, of the pressed flower, of the man who had shown her what it felt like to be seen. She reached out in her hand, calloused and smudged with dirt, gently covered his fingers were weak, but they twitched in response, a faint acknowledgement of her touch. "I'm not leaving," she said, her voice soft but steady, the words as solid and true as a vow. The weeks that followed Silas's return to consciousness were a slow, quiet dance of recovery. The deep, terrifying stillness of his unconsciousness was replaced by the arduous, incremental progress of a body mending itself. At first, he was too weak to do more than follow Ellie with his eyes as she moved about the small cabin. His silence was different now, no longer a choice of stoic temperament, but a necessity of profound exhaustion. And so, Ellie became his voice, his hands, his strength. She continued to feed him, but now his eyes were open, watching her with a quiet, unnerving intensity. The dynamic had shifted. She was no longer just tending to an unconscious form. She was caring for the man. And his silent, constant gaze was a testament to his complete and utter dependency on her. It was a role reversal that was both terrifying and deeply empowering. He, the unbreachable wall, had become as vulnerable as a child, and she, the frightened stray, had become his foundation. Slowly, strength seeped back into him. The day he first sat up on his own, the effort leaving him pale and trembling, felt like a monumental victory. A week later, he took his first halting steps. His hand braced against the cabin wall, his jaw tight with concentration. Ellie hovered nearby, her hands outstretched, ready to catch him. But he never fell. His will was as strong and unyielding as the rock of the mesas. He began to spend his days sitting on the porch, his rifle resting across his lap, his gaze scanning the vast, empty horizon. The threat of Harker's return was an unspoken shadow that lay over their peaceful existence. But Silas's presence on the porch, a silent, recovering sentinel, was a reassurance. He was a guardian returning to his post. Their quiet language of gestures returned, but now it was imbued with a new, deeper layer of intimacy. She would bring him a cup of coffee, and his fingers would linger against hers for a moment longer than necessary. He would watch her working in the garden, and when she came inside, she would find that he had filled the water bucket for her, a small concession to his returning strength and a silent acknowledgement of her labor. The roles of caregiver and patient began to blur, replaced by a simple, profound partnership. They were two people in a small, isolated space, their lives completely intertwined, their pasts laid bare, the trauma they had shared, the violence that had nearly torn them apart, had instead forged a bond of trust so absolute that words seemed flimsy and inadequate. He had seen the worst of her past, and she had seen him at his absolute weakest. There were no secrets, no pretenses, only a shared, quiet reality. One evening, weeks after the attack, A cool wind began to blow down from the mountains, a harbinger of the changing seasons. It was a restless, sighing wind that rattled the window frame and whispered through the cracks in the cabin walls, making the warm, flickering lamplight inside feel like a precious, protected sanctuary. Tom was long asleep in his cot, his breathing a soft, rhythmic whisper in the quiet. Silas was sitting at the table, his hands busy with a piece of cottonwood, a small, sharp knife moving with slow, practiced skill, carving the wood into the shape of a bird for the boy. The head wound had left a thin, pale scar at his temple, a permanent reminder of how close they had come to losing everything. Ellie sat near the hearth, mending a tear in Tom's shirt, her needle moving in and out of the rough fabric. The silence in the room was comfortable, familiar. But inside her, a storm was gathering, one that mirrored the restless wind outside. She had been given a second chance at life here, in this quiet, forgotten place. She had found safety. She had found a home. And she had found a man who looked at her not as property, not as a burden, but as an equal. The gratitude she felt for him had long ago blossomed into something deeper, something that made her heart ache with a strange, sweet pain whenever he looked at her. But her past was a ghost that still haunted her. The idea of being a woman, of the intimacy between a man and a woman, was inextricably linked in her mind with violence, ownership, and fear. It was a transaction, a debt, an act of being claimed. It was Harker's leering smile and her father's averted eyes. How could she ever separate the act of love from the act of violation? She set her sewing aside, her hands suddenly trembling. She looked at Silas, at the quiet strength in his hands, at the gentle focus in his eyes as he worked. If she was ever to be whole, if she was ever to truly leave the frightened girl from the train behind, it had to be with him. Only with him could it be different. Only with him could she feel safe enough to be so vulnerable. Her heart began to pound, a frantic, heavy rhythm against her ribs. She stood up, her legs feeling unsteady. He looked up from his carving, his hands stilling, his pale eyes questioning in the lamplight. She walked to the table and stood before him, her hands clasped tightly in front of her to keep them from shaking. She had to force the words out, her voice a low, wavering whisper. "Silas," she began, her throat dry. "When I was with my father, and with Harker, the way they looked at me, it was like I wasn't a person. I was a thing, a problem to be solved, or a prize to be won." She took a shaky breath, forcing herself to meet his steady gaze. "They talked about me being a woman, but they made the word sound dirty, like something that happens to you, whether you want it or not." She looked down at her hands, at the calluses and dirt stains from her work in the garden. These were her hands. This was her life. She had a choice for the first time. "I know what it is to be a girl," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the sighing of the wind. "A girl who is scared, and who has to run. But I have never been a woman." She looked up at him again, her eyes pleading, laying her deepest, most fragile fear at his feet. If my first time is to be with you, I need to ask, can you be slow?" The question hung in the air between them, shimmering with a terrifying vulnerability. It was the ultimate act of trust, offering him the broken pieces of her past and asking him to help her make them whole again. Silas did not move for a long moment. His face was a mask of shadows and light, his expression unreadable. He simply looked at her, and in his eyes she saw a profound, heart-stopping understanding. He was not just hearing her words, he was hearing the lifetime of fear and shame that lay beneath them. He set the knife and the half-carved bird gently on the table. Then, slowly, he reached out and took her trembling hand in his. His hand was large and warm, his palm rough with the calluses of a hard life. It enveloped hers completely. He didn't pull her closer or make any other move. He just held her hand, his thumb gently stroking the back of it. It was an anchor in the storm of her emotions. He met her gaze, his own eyes clear and steady. "Slow," he said, his voice a low, rough vow. He gave her hand a gentle, reassuring squeeze. And safe. I swear it. Ellie. The simple words, spoken with such quiet, solemn gravity, were the most profound comfort she had ever known. He understood. He understood that her request was not about the physical act, but about the reclamation of her own soul. It was a plea for tenderness in a world that had only shown her brutality. A tear she hadn't realized she was holding back slid down her cheek. He lifted his other hand and gently, with the rough pad of his thumb, wiped it away. His touch was as light as a feather. The air in the room was thick with unspoken emotion. The need for words was over. He stood up, still holding her hand, and gently drew her away from the table, toward the faint warmth of the dying fire. He didn't lead her to his cot, or to hers. He just led her to the center of the small room, to the heart of their shared home. He released her hand and his arms came around her, pulling her into a slow, gentle embrace. It was not an embrace of passion, but of sanctuary. She rested her head against his chest, the rough wool of his shirt soft against her cheek. She could feel the slow, steady beat of his heart beneath her ear, a rhythm of calm and absolute safety. She wrapped her own arms around his waist, holding on as if he were the only solid thing in a spinning world. They stood like that for a long time, held in the warm bubble of the lamplight, while the lonely wind howled outside. There were no kisses, no fumbling with clothes, no demands. There was only the profound, silent intimacy of being held, of being safe. He rested his chin on the top of her head, his breath warm in her hair. She felt the tension she had carried in her body for years, the constant, coiled readiness to flee, begin to unwind, to melt away in the solid strength of his arms. She tilted her head back, and he looked down at her. In the flickering light, his face was full of a tenderness she had never seen before. His eyes spoke of a deep and abiding care, of a promise being kept. He lowered his head, and for a moment she thought he might kiss her, but instead he simply rested his forehead against hers. They stood there, breathing the same air, their gazes locked. A long, shuddering sigh escaped her lips, a sound that seemed to carry with it all the pain and fear of her past. It was a release, a letting go. His own breath hitched, and a moment later, he let out a slow sigh of his own, a sound of profound relief, of a long-held loneliness finally coming to an end. Their breaths mingled in the small space between them, a warm, shared exhalation that was more intimate than any kiss. That was their first time, not of the body, but of the soul. It was the quiet, solemn joining of two broken people who had, against all odds, found a way to make each other whole again. It was a promise, made and kept, in the heart of a wild and unforgiving land. It was slow, and it was safe. The vow made in the dark of the cabin, a promise of slowness and safety, was not a prelude to a single night, but the foundation for a new season of life. As Silas's body healed, so too did the bruised and battered spirit of their small, makeshift family. The oppressive heat of summer gave way to the gentle gold of autumn. The days grew shorter, the light softer, and the air carried a crisp, clean edge that spoke of new beginnings. Life on the ranch fell into a rhythm not of survival, but of living. The frantic, anxious energy that had once permeated their existence was gone, replaced by a deep, comforting sense of permanence. Mornings began before sunrise, with the smell of strong coffee and sizzling bacon filling the small cabin. Ellie would move about the room, her steps light, packing a small lunch of bread and dried meat for Silas and Raoul. Silas, his strength almost fully returned, would stand by the door with the old man, their low voices a quiet rumble as they planned the day's work, a section of fence to mend, a stray calf to be brought back from the high pasture. Tom, no longer a solemn, watchful shadow, would be underfoot, his laughter a bright, new sound in the house as he chased a chicken that had darted inside. After the men left, the day would settle into a peaceful routine. Ellie's garden, Once a desperate, scrabbly patch of earth had become her kingdom under her patient, determined care. It had flourished into a small, miraculous riot of life. The tomato vines were heavy with ripe, red fruit, their sweet, earthy scent perfuming the air. Fat orange squashes grew in the shade of broad, dark green leaves. Her mint patch had spread, a fragrant carpet, and she had carefully cultivated other herbs: rosemary, thyme, sage from seeds Raoul had brought back from a rare trip to a distant trading post. She would spend hours there, on her knees in the soft earth, her hands stained, a wide-brimmed hat shielding her from the sun. This small plot of land was more than just a source of food. It was a testament to her own resilience. She was no longer a tumbleweed, blown about by the harsh winds of fate. She had put down roots. She was nurturing life, and in turn, she was being nurtured by the simple, profound satisfaction of the work. She was feeding her family from the soil she tilled with her own hands, and the act filled her with a sense of pride and purpose that was as nourishing as the food itself. The afternoons were long and golden. On the porch, Raoul would often sit in his favorite chair, the wood worn smooth by years of use, and light his pipe. The sweet, pungent smoke would drift on the breeze as he stared out at the vast landscape. A quiet, contented patriarch watching over his domain. Tom, his pockets full of treasures, smooth stones, colorful feathers. The shed skin of a snake would play in the dust, his small voice narrating elaborate, silent adventures. He no longer jumped at loud noises or scanned the horizon with wary eyes. The world, for him, had become a safe and wonderful place to be explored. In this new atmosphere of peace, Silas himself seemed to have changed. The hard, impenetrable shell of the silent stranger had softened. While his words remained few, his presence was different. He was more relaxed, the constant tension in his shoulders gone. Sometimes, as Ellie worked in the garden, she would feel his eyes on her and look up to see him watching from the corral, a quiet, contemplative look on his face. It wasn't the look of a guard watching a charge, but of a man simply observing the woman he cared for. A small, almost imperceptible smile touching the corners of his mouth. The broken corral gate, a casualty of the attack, had been a constant, ugly reminder of the violence that had shattered their peace. For weeks, it had been patched up with rope and spare boards, a temporary fix. One bright, cool morning, Silas walked over to it, shaking his head at the flimsy repair. "Time to build a new one," he said, looking at Ellie. It wasn't a command, but an invitation. They spent the day working together, a team moving in the easy, unspoken rhythm they had developed. They tore down the old, splintered wood, clearing the ground for a new, stronger gate. Silas, with his methodical strength, dug new post holes, his muscles flexing under his shirt. Ellie cleared away the debris, her movements quick and efficient. He showed her how to measure the new timbers, his large, calloused hand guiding hers on the wood. Sending a jolt of warmth through her, they worked the long two-man saw together, pulling it back and forth in a steady, hypnotic rhythm. Sawdust flying, the clean, sharp scent of pine filling the air. Their bodies moved in perfect unison, a dance of shared labor. It was in these small, shared moments that their love story was truly being written. When he lifted a heavy new post into place, she rushed to brace it, her shoulder pressing against his arm. He grunted his thanks, and their eyes met over the rough-hewn wood. The glance held for a fraction of a second too long, a silent conversation passing between them, full of a deep, comfortable affection that needed no words. Later, as he was setting the hinges, he reached for a tool without looking. "Wrench," he murmured. She was already there, pressing the cool, heavy metal into his outstretched hand. His fingers closed over hers, his grip firm and warm for a moment before he took the tool. The touch was brief, accidental, but it left her skin tingling. It was in these fleeting connections, these sparks of contact in the midst of their work, that their bond was being forged, stronger and more durable than the iron and wood they were shaping. Tom played nearby, bringing them drinks of water, proudly displaying a horned lizard he'd caught. He was a part of their work, a small, happy planet orbiting the sun of their shared purpose. At one point, Raoul shuffled out from the porch, a tin cup of coffee in his hand, and watched them for a while, a rare, gummy smile on his face. He looked at the man, the woman, and the child, at the sturdy gate rising from their combined efforts, and gave a single, satisfied nod before turning back to his chair. By late afternoon, the gate was finished. It was a fine, strong thing, its timbers straight and true, its new iron hinges gleaming in the sun. It was a statement, a declaration that this place was protected, that it was a home built to last. Silas and Ellie stood side by side, their shoulders nearly touching, and looked at their work. A shared sense of pride and accomplishment settled over them. They had built this together. "It's a good gate," she said softly. "We did good work," he replied, his voice a low rumble of satisfaction. He turned to look at her, his face smudged with dirt, his pale eyes full of a warm, gentle light. The setting sun caught in her hair, turning it to a halo of fire. The wind whipped a loose strand across her face, and before she could brush it away, he reached out, his movement slow and deliberate, and tucked it behind her ear. His fingers, rough and calloused, were impossibly gentle against her skin. His hand didn't move away, but slid down to cup her cheek, his thumb stroking her jawline. It was a gesture of such simple, profound tenderness that it stole her breath. She leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering closed for a moment. This was the language he spoke, the language of quiet, meaningful action, and she understood it perfectly. Just then, Tom, finished with his adventures, came running toward them, his small legs pumping. He didn't slow down, but launched himself at them, wrapping one arm around Ellie's leg and the other around Silas's. He looked up at them, his face beaming, a picture of pure, unadulterated childhood joy. "Our gate," he announced proudly, "our—" Silas's hand dropped from her cheek and came to rest on the boy's head, ruffling his hair. Ellie looked down at the child who had become her son in all but blood, his small body a living bridge between them. She looked at the strong, new gate, a symbol of the future they were building, and she looked at Silas, the quiet, steady man who had become the center of her world, who was now smiling a real, genuine smile that transformed his rugged face. In that one perfect, golden moment, Ellie understood. There was no need for a declaration. There was no need for a proposal spoken on bended knee, no need for vows exchanged before a preacher. The words had already been spoken, in every shared task, every quiet glance, every gentle touch. Their vows were written in the flourishing rose of her garden, in the sound of Tom's laughter, in the sturdy timbers of the gate they had built together. They weren't becoming a family. They already were one, the life she had never even dared to imagine. A life of peace, love, and belonging was the life she was already living, right here, right now, under the vast, benevolent sky of the high desert. The last rays of the afternoon sun slanted across the yard, turning the red dust to gold and painting long, deep blue shadows behind the barn and the newly built gate. The air was still and cool, carrying the faint, sweet scent of wood smoke from the chimney and the earthy aroma of Ellie's sleeping garden. It was an hour of profound peace, a time when the world seemed to hold its breath before sinking into the soft embrace of twilight. On the porch, the small family was assembled in their usual, comfortable tableau. Raoul sat in his chair, his pipe unlit, his eyes closed in a light doze. Tom was on the bottom step, meticulously arranging his collection of pebbles into a new, intricate pattern, his small face a mask of concentration. Ellie sat on the top step, her back resting against the warm wood of the cabin wall, a half-mended shirt in her lap, though her hands were still. And Silas. He was leaning against the porch railing beside her, his arms crossed, his gaze fixed on the distant, purple line of the mountains. He had been quiet for a long time, but it was a comfortable, shared silence, as natural and easy as breathing. In the months since his recovery, they had settled into a life that felt as if it had always been this way. The raw, jagged edges of their shared trauma had been smoothed over by the steady, gentle rhythm of the days. The fear was a distant ghost, a story that belonged to two other people, a boy and a girl on a train, a lifetime ago. Ellie looked at the man beside her. She saw the familiar, rugged lines of his profile, the pale scar that was now a faint, silvery mark at his temple. She saw the quiet strength in the set of his shoulders, the calm in his steady gaze. He was no longer a stranger, a savior, an enigma. He was Silas, the man who drank his coffee black, who had a surprising gentleness with small, broken things, whose rare, slow smile could make her heart ache. He was the center of her new world, the anchor that held her fast against all storms. She thought back to that first night, a terrified, ragged creature tumbling into his cattle car. She had been so small, so consumed by a fear that was bigger than she was. Her world had been a dark, narrow place, and her only thought had been to find a corner to hide in, a shadow to disappear into. And he had given her one, a sanctuary woven from the rough canvas of his coat. Her hands, which had been resting in her lap, clenched for a moment on the fabric of the shirt. She had come so far from that girl. The world was no longer a place to hide from. It was a place to live in. This small patch of earth, this cabin, this family. It was a life she had helped to build, a life she had defended. And she realized, with a sudden, breathtaking clarity, that her desires had changed as profoundly as she had. The need for refuge had been replaced by a yearning for belonging. She turned her head, her gaze soft as she looked up at him. "Silas," she said, her voice a quiet murmur, barely disturbing the evening's peace. He shifted his gaze from the mountains to her, his pale eyes questioning. She took a slow breath, gathering her thoughts, wanting to give them the simple, honest weight they deserved. "Do you remember that first night on the train?" A flicker of memory, of understanding, passed through his eyes. He gave a single, slow nod. "I was so scared," she whispered, the memory still sharp enough to make her shiver. "The whole world felt like it was hunting me. When I saw you, you were just this big, dark shape in the corner. You were another man, and all I had ever known of men was pain and betrayal." She looked down at her hands. "But I was so desperate. And when I asked for help, you lifted your coat. You didn't ask questions. You just hid me." She looked back up at him, her heart in her eyes. "That was all I wanted in the whole world right then, just to be hidden, to disappear under your coat where they couldn't find me." She paused, the weight of her next words filling the space between them. "I wanted to hide then. That was enough." She reached out, her hand hesitant for a moment before she laid it gently on his forearm. His muscles were hard as stone beneath his shirt. He didn't move, but she felt him grow still, his entire being focused on her. "But now," she said, her voice growing stronger, imbued with a quiet, certain joy. "Now I don't want to hide anymore. I don't want to be under your coat. I just want to be beside you." Her fingers tightened slightly on his arm. "Whether the sun is shining or the rain is falling, whether the work is hard or the day is easy, for all the days to come, that's what I want now." It was not a plea. It was not a request. It was a statement of fact, a declaration of where her heart had finally found its home. It was the simplest, truest thing she had ever said. Silas looked down at her, his face unreadable in the deepening shadows. The wind picked up, rustling the dry leaves in the cottonwood tree, the only sound in the sudden, charged silence. For a long moment, he just held her gaze. He was a man of few words, and she knew that now. In this moment that mattered more than any other, he would not use them. He would speak in his own language. Slowly, he uncrossed his arms. He reached down and took her hand, the one that was resting on his forearm. His fingers wrapped around hers, his grip not crushing, but firm, solid, and absolute. It was a grip that spoke of permanence, of a promise being silently sealed. It was an answer more powerful and more profound than any word he could have spoken. It said, "I am here. I am not leaving. We are together." He held her hand and gently tugged, a silent invitation. She stood up, her mending falling, forgotten to the porch. He didn't release her hand, but kept it tucked firmly in his own as he stepped down from the porch. He started walking, not toward the barn or the corral, but out, away from the small cluster of buildings, toward the open land that stretched out before them. They walked in silence, hand in hand, their steps falling into a familiar, easy rhythm. They passed the sturdy new gate, a symbol of the life they had rebuilt. They walked past her garden, its sleeping plants a testament to her patient care. They walked toward a gentle slope where, in the last light of day, a scattering of wild desert marigolds still bloomed, their yellow heads like small, resilient suns against the red earth. From the slope, they could hear a sound drifting on the cool evening air, the sound of pure, untroubled joy. It was Tom's laughter, a bright, silvery peal that seemed to make the very air sparkle. He was there, at the top of the slope, chasing a jackrabbit that darted and weaved just out of his reach, his small body a blur of happy, boundless energy. They stopped at the bottom of the slope and stood watching him, their joined hands a warm, solid anchor between them. Ellie looked at the laughing boy, her heart swelling with a love so fierce it almost hurt. She looked at the vast, beautiful land that had once been a place of terror and was now her sanctuary, her home. And she looked at the quiet, steady man standing beside her, his hand holding hers as if he never intended to let go. The fear was gone. The need to run had vanished, replaced by a deep and abiding desire to stay, to stand her ground, to build a life. She was no longer a victim of her past, but the author of her future. The promise Silas had made to her in the dark, the vow that had seemed so momentous and fragile at the time, had become the simple, unremarkable truth of her existence. He had sworn it would be slow and safe, and it was. Every sunrise, every shared meal, every quiet evening was a reaffirmation of that pledge. Life unfolded not in a rush, but with the steady, patient pace of the changing seasons, and safety was no longer a place to hide, but the feeling of his hand in hers. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're tuning in from, so please drop a comment below to say hello and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850. Give this video a like, and consider hitting the hype button to help us share these stories with even more people.